Ever felt like the world's geopolitical plates are shifting under your feet? It seems like how nations interact is fundamentally changing, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a really dynamic landscape and, yeah, sometimes disorienting.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into some truly thought-provoking sources that explore these significant shifts, specifically in U.S. foreign policy.
hmm
We'll be looking at America's alliances, its global economic approach, and even, the very definition of its role in the world.
And what's really interesting, I think, looking at these documents, reports from RAND, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, plus analyses of a recent presidency, is how they really challenge some long-held assumptions.
Right.
They highlight a viewpoint that rigorously prioritizes national interest, maybe a more transactional view of international relations.
So our mission here is to really extract the core arguments laid out in these materials. We're presenting these conservative foreign policy perspectives, trying to help you understand the forces reshaping America's global posture.
Yeah, basically helping you, the learner, grasp what these shifts might mean for navigating, well, this complex world we're in.
Okay, so let's start by looking at the core ideas. There's been this significant recent shift in foreign policy thinking, one that explicitly challenges what some people call the post-Cold War consensus.
Yeah, if you zoom out a bit, many of these sources talk about a, let's say, profound dissatisfaction with previous foreign policy.
Dissatisfaction how?
Well, they criticize it for being driven by randomness or ideology. The argument is it led to chaos, not really strategic purpose. The feeling, according to these analyses, was that, hubris had replaced realism.
Resulting in foreign policy disaster after another, as one source put it.
Exactly.
So what's the alternative proposed in these sources? It wasn't really about pulling up the drawbridge, was it? Not isolationism.
No, not exactly. It was more about a refocused America First approach. The emphasis is on national security and, importantly, economic independence. So, arguing for rebuilding a strong military, the phrase dominance must be unquestioned comes up. But also, crucially, fundamentally changing things like trade, immigration, and economic policies.
To put Americans first again, right?
Yeah.
And boost tax revenue.
That's the idea. And there was this line about how the U.S. would not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example.
So it's less about intervention and more about internal strength being the model.
Sort of. It represents quite a fundamental recalibration, shifting focus away from maybe global integration towards internal strengthening.
Even if that means potentially straining traditional alliances.
Well, that's certainly where some of the tension arose.
Okay, let's get into that. One of the most prominent areas where this America First idea really played out was with alliances, particularly NATO, and this issue of burden sharing that's been bubbling for years, hasn't it?
Oh, indeed. And the sources we looked at present a pretty strong argument that Europe must do far more for its own defense.
Right.
There's one perspective arguing that, look, 100,000 U.S. troops are simply not needed to prevent Russia from conquering NATO territory.
Really?
Okay.
What's the reasoning there?
The view is that Russia's going to be rebuilding its forces for decades, pretty much regardless of what happens in Ukraine, and that actually the conventional balance of power has never been more favorable to NATO Europe than it is now, especially compared to the Cold War.
Huh. That's quite a statement. And it gets really interesting when you look at the actual spending numbers, right? Despite that 2014 Wales Declaration, the 2% GDP target, many NATO nations actually slashed their spending way down after the Berlin Wall fell.
Yeah, leaving them, as one source puts it, unprepared to confront a deteriorating threat environment, which is quite a contrast.
And that deteriorating environment is not just Russia anymore, is it?
No, definitely not. The sources point to the Chinese Communist Party as a pacing challenge, threatening Taiwan, supporting Russia and Iran.
Okay.
Then you have Russia itself, obviously active in Ukraine, but also the Baltic Sea, the Arctic, using Wagner forces in Africa.
Right. And then there's Iran, which is practically on Europe's doorstep, getting closer to a nuclear weapons breakout. These aren't, minor issues.
So the data shows this big gap, but it has pushed some countries to act.
It seems so. You see countries like Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. They're now aiming for a pretty ambitious 5% GDP defense target by 2028.
Wow, 5%.
Yeah. And Denmark's moving above 3%. Even Germany is talking about potentially loosening fiscal chains for defense, which is a huge shift for them.
That is a big shift. So a key insight here is this very transactional view from the U.S. side, feeling like it was being taken advantage of by free-riding allies.
Exactly. And that led to some really forceful calls for allies to spend more, some proposals even hitting 4% of GDP.
Which must have caused friction.
Oh, definitely.
Mm.
You had leaders like Emmanuel Macron famously describing NATO as experiencing brain death.
I remember that.
But then others, like Angela Merkel at the time, pushed back, disagreeing with such, drastic words. It really highlighted the divisions within the alliance. But despite all that rhetoric, the sources do suggest the U.S. technically maintained its commitment to Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause.
Yes. Formally, the commitment remained. The U.S. even reinforced its military presence in Europe. Things like the European Deterrence Initiative continued.
Okay.
But the pressure definitely spurred Europeans to explore more strategic autonomy. Efforts like PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, kicked off.
Right, PESCO. But that raised some concerns in the U.S., didn't it? That it might become sort of protectionist.
Yeah, the worry was it could become a protectionist vehicle, maybe prioritizing European defense companies and potentially shutting out U.S. competitors.
Okay, so moving from military alliances, this shift in thinking also mirrored a kind of fundamental rethink of America's role in the global economy.
Absolutely. There's a strong argument presented for economic independence. It's often contrasted sharply with what some sources called a leadership class that worships globalism over Americanism.
That's strong language.
It is, and placing it in context, this perspective viewed those globalist policies almost as a betrayal of the foundational principles of the Republic.
A betrayal? How so?
Well, the argument was that these policies effectively allowed other countries to, quote, subsidize their goods, devalue their currencies, violate their agreements, and cheat in every way imaginable.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately hurting American industries and workers.
That was the core argument, yes.
So how did this translate into actual policy then? We saw things like tariffs.
Exactly. Tariffs on steel, aluminum. There were even threats of tariffs on European cars, discussions around a digital services tax.
Right.
The stated aim was clearly to create a fairer, more balanced trade relationship, moving away from a system perceived as, well, disadvantageous for the U.S.
And this brings up the big one,
Yeah.
China. The concern went beyond just trade deficits, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, it shifted pretty quickly. It became much more about preventing China's acquisition of U.S. technology and actively countering their Made in China 2025 strategy.
Right. That's their big push for global dominance in high-tech sectors like robotics, AI.
Exactly. Often using state subsidies, forcing technology transfers, intellectual property issues. It was seen as a direct competitive and security challenge.
So efforts included things like restricting Huawei's role in 5G networks.
Yes, precisely. Pushing allies to limit Huawei due to data security concerns, all part of a broader push towards, technological self-reliance for the U.S.
And the sources also mentioned pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate.
Yeah, claiming it hurt U.S. businesses and workers.
And abandoning the Iran nuclear deal, applying that maximum pressure campaign instead.
Correct. So those were significant departures from previous policy as well, fitting that same pattern of prioritizing national interest as defined by this perspective.
Okay. So beyond trade and alliances, this approach also involved a critical reevaluation of military intervention abroad and its consequences back home.
Yes. And one really compelling point highlighted is this perspective that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan showed something important.
Which was
that while the U.S. military can definitely achieve victories on the battlefield, creating lasting stability is far more difficult.
That seems hard to argue with.
And the sources consistently indicate that Americans are now extremely wary of major war in the Middle East. There is a high burden of proof needed for any future intervention.
And long-term nation-building missions are just
deeply unpopular, according to these analyses.
So how did this view apply to threats like ISIS?
Well, the sources suggest a view that the threat posed by ISIS was often framed as an alarmist exaggeration.
Really? Exaggeration.
The point made was that isolated, homegrown offenders actually carried out only a few of the world's 1,900 most deadly terrorist attacks over several decades. And often these individuals suffered from mental illness.
So challenging the narrative of a huge existential threat requiring massive foreign campaigns.
Kind of recontextualizing the domestic threat level, yes.
Then this ties into another critical point about the costs of war, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A strong emphasis that the public must also understand the costs of war and know how we will pay them before going in.
No more free lunch wars funded by debt.
Exactly. The argument is firmly against deficit spending for wars, instead advocating that maybe taxes increased or some domestic priorities, be foregone to actually account for the expense.
Which ties back into that economic independence theme, right? Keep resources focused domestically unless absolutely vital for core security.
Precisely. It's all interconnected within this worldview.
Okay, and what about cybersecurity? That's obviously huge now.
The sources touch on that long-running debate about government access to encrypted data.
The whole backdoor debate.
Right, arguing that policies forcing these backdoors into commercial encryption don't just erode privacy, but actually endanger the security of the internet for commerce.
So the argument is that weakening encryption for law enforcement actually creates broader risks.
Yes, and it's noted that law enforcement already has considerable capabilities anyway. The overall perspective presented is that the liberty benefits of strong encryption come at much cost to security, essentially framing strong encryption as preferable despite the challenges for law enforcement.
Interesting trade-off. And finally, immigration. How does that fit into this reevaluation?
Well, the sources highlight an economic reality. They point out that some industries, frankly, would slow to a crawl or cease to function without immigrants willing to do tough jobs for relatively modest pay.
A practical economic point.
Yeah. So the challenge for policymakers from this specific viewpoint is to align the law with the underlying economic realities, perhaps by greatly expanding the quota for legal immigrants, acknowledging the economy's needs within a controlled legal framework.
Okay. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground there. From NATO's perceived brain death debate to the intricacies of economic nationalism and this fundamental rethinking of military intervention. These sources definitely paint a picture of a significant, deliberate shift in America's global posture.
Yeah, if you connect it all, it's clear these sources present a foreign policy view that advocates for a really fundamental reevaluation of America's role. It's an approach prioritizing national interest, national sovereignty, moving away consciously from previous globalist ideals.
Right, and challenging allies to carry more weight, both militarily and economically.
Exactly, bearing more responsibility.
So what does this all mean for you listening?
Well, it means understanding that, as one source puts it, the transatlantic relationship of the Cold War and post-Cold War eras has definitively been transformed.
Things have changed. Europe, for instance, is now likely expected to bear greater responsibilities for continental stability, especially concerning Russia, as the U.S. shifts its strategic focus.
Yeah. It really begs the question, doesn't it? How does the U.S. balance these refocused national interests with the, well, undeniable need for international cooperation, especially in a world where trade and tech are so deeply tied to national security now? It's a huge question. And this perspective suggests that, yeah, tough choices loom on the horizon. There aren't easy answers here.
Definitely something for you to mull over. In this evolving landscape, where does America's true strength really lie? Is it in that traditional global leadership role, or more in a renewed focus on internal resilience and strategic independence? And maybe more broadly, what will it actually take for nations, all nations, to navigate these complex shifts and find a path towards a stable global future?